Okay, we shall start. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Kuwait Public Policy Center, KPPC, we would like to kick off this evening with our flagship series of a lecture. Today, we have an esteemed guest, Mr. Greg Power. He'll be talking about his theme of unsticking sticky institutions, using behavioral insights to drive organizational change, policymaking, and public sector reform. So about the lecture, this talk will reflect some of the themes in his book, due to be published next year, entitled Inside the Political Mind, Politics, Behavior, and Getting Change in Complex Places. The book draws on his experiences over the last 15 years and brings together ideas from behavioral economics, change management, and political science to highlight the importance of understanding the human dimension when trying to reform the institutions of governments. So a quick background about our speaker tonight, Greg Power. He's the founder and board chair of Global Partners Governance Practice, GPG, works with politicians, ministers, and civil servants to manage the process of change in government and parliament. Since setting up GPG in 2005, Greg has worked throughout the Middle East, Africa, and Eastern Europe in countries including Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq, Uganda, Rwanda, Sudan, Ukraine, and the Balkans. Prior to setting up GPG, he was a senior political advisor in the British government to ministers Robin Cook and Peter Hain. He is currently a senior visiting fellow at the University of Birmingham International Development Department and is a social entrepreneur in residence at INSEAD Business School. Allow us to warmly welcome this evening's guest, Mr. Greg Power. The floor is yours, sir.
Alice, thank you very much. It's lovely to be with you. And it's a long time since I've been in Kuwait. This year has been an odd year for travel. So it's nice to be with you in spirit if I'm not with you in person. But I hope to be with you again in Kuwait at some point in the next few months, we hope. As Faris just said, the talk this evening is based on a book I'm in the process of writing about politics and change, effectively. As you mentioned, my organisation, GPG, works with politicians, with ministers, with civil servants in various parts of the world. And prior to that, I was a political advisor to ministers in the British government. I will start by sharing my screen, and I'll explain some of the genesis of this book. And as Faris said, the title of the talk is Unsticking Sticky Institutions. I didn't realise how difficult that was to say. It's better written down. It's easier to write it down than it is to say it. But part of the point of the book, it started from two main questions. The first is that political institutions themselves seem very resistant to change. In the course of my work internationally and my experience of being in the British government as well, where I was working for Robin Cook and Peter Hain in trying to reform Parliament, the Westminster, the House of Commons and the House of Lords, which surprised me how difficult it was. And the second question related to that, which has come out in the course of the last 20 years or so, is why do politicians do weird things? When you present them with very sensible, coherent, strategic arguments for change, often you find there is opposition, and the opposition often surprises you. The resistance to change will often surprise you. And it's partly because I think the analysis of those institutions, of government, of the public sector, of parliaments, is that it is often based on the theory of how these institutions should work, the principle and the academic analysis. But that academic analysis, that theory, is at some distance from the practicalities of trying to get institutions to reform. And a lot of these thoughts started to cohere into the idea for a book when I was reading Francis Fukuyama's two very big books on political change and political history, and they're long, but they're well worth a read, about the whole history of how political institutions have developed. And as he points out, and one of the themes throughout that book is that you have to understand political institutions as human institutions. As that quote there says, institutions are initially created to meet the certain needs of societies, but they then turn to grow rigid and fail to adapt. And there is an inherent conservatism to human behaviour that tends to invest institutions with emotional significance once they're in place. And it's often that human element which provides most of the stickiness. People themselves tend to be quite sticky and set in their ways. So the point of the book is to try and explore some of these theories, looking at how politicians think and what this means for reforming political institutions of government. This goes back a while, some of these questions. When I first started working for the British government, I came from the civil society, from the think tank world, where I was writing a lot about democratic reform, about constitutional change, and I was steeped in the academic analysis of how institutions should work, especially political institutions. I got a rude awakening when I arrived in government, because what looks very obvious and straightforward from the outside looks much less obvious and easy once you're inside government. The first two questions being, what's in this for the government? And why on earth should we make our lives more difficult than they need to be? And so rather than, whilst I was working in the think tank world, I could easily write lots of papers about how politics should work, how institutions should be reformed. But these papers weren't going to work in a cabinet meeting. I needed to provide the ministers that I was working for with arguments that they could use to persuade their often reluctant fellow ministers that this sort of change was a good thing. And so it was a telling experience for me of being in government and trying to maneuver that change through the political institutions. And a lot of the lessons that I learnt in government have been reinforced by those experiences. As far as mentioned at the beginning, we've worked in around 50 countries now over the last 15 years. I won't list them all, but obviously extensively across the Middle East and North Africa, which have tended to reinforce an awful lot of those first insights about the need to understand why human beings behave the way that they do, why they are resistant to change in the first place, and what that means particularly for politics and for government. So to start with, the starting point for all of this, I'm sure a lot of you watching this will be familiar with the whole industry of change management that exists, and the fact that there are so many books devoted to the subject of change management is testament to the fact of how hard it actually is to get institutional organisational change. The John Cotter book there is probably the most well-known, and for those of you who read it, you'll know he sets out 8 stages of the need to reform and how you go about that process, by creating a sense of urgency, by building a coalition around that change, setting out a vision, combining short-term wins in the longer-term objectives of creating change, and making sure you consolidate those wins. And it's most of what has followed seems to follow a fairly similar pattern to the strategies that Cotter set out, with various variations to that. But the 4 main problems, I think, that seem to come out a lot of the change management material are firstly just the lack of urgency, the fact that institutions get set in their ways because there is a sense of inertia, familiarity. People like familiarity. They know when people are comfortable when they know what they're doing. And change brings uncertainty into that. The second point is that often the simple scale of change looks daunting. Often when reform programs or change efforts are introduced into any sort of organisation, they aim at big objectives. But the problem is these big objectives look very big and very daunting if you are one individual inside the institution, and the magnitude of the task is often off-putting. Thirdly, what you'll often find is those change efforts focus on the structures, but the people tend to keep doing the same things. So you might change processes, but unless you're bringing the people with you, performance isn't improving. You've just got arguably a slightly more efficient set of structures, but unless the people follow those structures, unless you've got their commitment, they keep doing the same things, and performance overall doesn't really improve. And then fourthly, there's this idea of competing commitments, which the Harvard Business Review has done a few things on, that even where you have commitment from individuals within an institution, within an organization, they will still, once they're out of their comfort zone, they will still find it difficult to change. Even though they've got a rhetorical commitment to that change, they're torn between what they know and what they need to do next. And what they know is what they tend to revert to. And as Cotter put it, this all adds up to the elegance and tenacity of the status quo. So those are the main problems in terms of organisation reform. Politics and political change is particularly hard for a number of different reasons, which I'll explain over the next 2 slides. My time in government, as I mentioned earlier, I was taken on specifically because I'd been writing about how to reform Westminster, writing about constitutional reform in the British context, and I was taken on by Robin Cook to help him think and implement some of these changes. And in doing that, one of the key parts of the British government, especially in relation to Parliament, is the Government Whip's Office, which controls the legislative process and essentially keeps all of the government's MPs in line to make sure they turn up and vote. And when they do turn up and vote, they vote the right way with the government. So they're, if you like, the enforcers of the government system of parliamentary politics in the UK. And I had a long conversation. I was engaging with the Whip's office on a daily basis, as well as with people from Downing Street at Number 10, about a lot of the changes we wanted to propose. And one of the key figures in the Whip's office, a very senior official, was key to getting any of these changes through. And I had several long conversations with him about the merits of these reforms that we were proposing, which would make, we argued, life easier. It would make the government would have, get its legislation through more quickly. It was much more efficient. It was a better use of parliamentary time. All very credible arguments. And at the end of this long conversation, where I sort of ended up my long lecture to this figure, I was feeling quite pleased with myself because I thought, these were all quite good arguments. He simply looked at me and said, look, these arguments, Greg, yeah, very good. Understand, that's, all very compelling. The thing is, the current system, we know what's wrong with the current system, but we know how to use it. He said, you start changing things, it introduces a level of uncertainty, and it starts to make things more unpredictable for us. Even though they might work better, we're not sure, so therefore, thanks, but no thanks. And it's very difficult to argue with somebody when you've made very good arguments and it's simply the idea of change that they don't like. It's not the merits of the individual changes themselves, it's just change. And this is where we start to sort of come into some of the insights from behavioural economics over the last couple of decades. The Thaler book there is one of the I'm sure many of you will know about this book. Thaler was joint author of Nudge with Cass Sunstein, and also Daniel Kahneman's book goes into this a lot as well. These are the best introductions to the idea of loss aversion and prospect theory, but there are a whole set of more detailed academic papers which underpin them. The key thing is loss aversion is, particularly developed by Kahneman and his collaborator Amos Tversky, where they effectively did a whole series of experiments working out how people react to losses as against gains. And these were often experiments to do with gambling. How much would you need to win in order to run the risk of losing $100? So essentially, if you are willing to bet $100 and you might lose it, in order to do that, what would you need to win? And generally, it has to be about twice as much, roughly speaking. And there's a whole series of experiments they did. The prospect of winning has to be far greater than the prospect of losing in order for people to be willing to take the risk, because people tend to feel loss much more than they tend to like the gains or feel about the gains. And this is a fascinating insight into how humans think and behave in relation to loss, but it's very, very rarely been used in terms of organisational change. And the problem is that, as I mentioned, most of those experiments were to do with money. The problem with organisational change and with institutional change, especially in politics, is that the main currency is power and authority. And when that is at risk, that magnifies this sense of loss. Losing $100 is, for most people, a temporary thing, a temporary loss. It's a sense you can somehow get over. The loss of power and authority could be permanent. And so therefore the sense of loss is much, much greater when you start to calculate the benefits, the pros and cons of change in that context. The thing is, this is very rarely been implemented when thinking about organizations and institutions, but there is a very telling quote in Kahneman's book where he says that, so I'm going to have to move this slide in order to see it, but plans for reform always produce many winners and some losers while achieving an overall improvement. If the affected parties have any political influence, potential losers will be more active and determined than potential winners. So what he's saying is essentially that those who stand to lose from change will fight far harder than those who have the prospect of winning, which again adds up to an additional difficulty in getting change through. This becomes further complicated by how humans then behave in this context. And I'll use parliaments as an example of just how complex this can be. We've spent a lot of time working with parliaments in different parts of the world. And the institutions, the legislative institutions are far more complex in terms of getting change through for 5 specific reasons. Firstly, there's no equivalent of a CEO. There's no one person in charge of a parliament. So there's no one to drive that change through, to start it from the top and drive it through. Every parliament will have a speaker or a president who is responsible for running the business, but they'll also have a secretary general or a clerk who is running the administration. There will also be other figures who have a stake and an interest and authority and power over how that parliamentary institution is run. It might be the Prime Minister, it might be a president, it could be the leaders of political parties, it could be committee chairs. There will be senior politicians who have an influence on this process. So whereas in most private sector organisations, there is one person at the top to drive change through, in parliaments and in many public sector organisations, that power tends to be dispersed. And what's more, that power, not only is it dispersed, but those in positions of authority, their power is highly contingent on how others feel about them holding power. Their willingness, their ability to maintain support amongst others is what determines whether they stay in power or not. Again, in a private sector organization, if you're a CEO, you can fairly reliably assume that you are going to be in charge for a certain period of time, provided you don't completely muck things up. The same is not true in politics or in government or in public sector institutions. And that power is always subject to challenge. The third point is linked to that. Those who have that power obviously have the most to lose from change, but they also have the greatest ability to prevent change happening in the first place. So it might be that, if you're a speaker and as I mentioned to this example from the British government, if you're a speaker of a parliament and change is coming, why risk it? If you know that your power is reliant on the current system, you introduce some uncertainty into it by introducing any change. But added to that, in order to get structural procedural changes through any parliament, you will need politicians, members of parliament, to vote for it. It will have to go through a debate. It will have to go through a vote in the plenary session, which means that every politician, in every member of the parliamentary institution, the parliamentary organisation, has a stake in the outcome, an opinion, and an influence. And in my experience, I saw more heated arguments between members of parliament about changes to procedure than any ideological issue, because it went to the heart of how they worked. And these weren't arguments about policy or ideology. It was about personal preference, about how they wanted to work, and any change brought into it was going to affect that. And like with every other organisation, once pay and conditions issues are brought into the equation, this becomes a very, very personal thing. So the whole idea of parliamentary reform for every politician is a highly personal thing. So that means that then trying to get any change through, you have to be able to maintain, to put together in the first place, and then maintain a very diverse coalition of interests within the parliament. And it's difficult to predict because it's not based on ideology. It's not based on party affiliation. It's not based on any of the predictable things that you find in most parliaments about where you see the dividing lines between different politicians. Because it's personal, it's very difficult to predict. And trying to keep this sort of coalition together is like herding a group of cats. It's almost impossible to do. So what that tends to mean is the whole history of parliamentary reform is that nobody really gets what they want. You end up with a series of compromises, which don't really serve the original purpose, and often are, the second best option of everybody. And change ends up as a form of bricolage, where those who have power try to hold on to it, and their positions aren't really swept away. But new positions are created as new power centres for other politicians to give them something of what they want. And you end up with very odd and unstrategic looking organisations. Now, a lot of that, that's specific to Parliament, but I use that as an example because it tells you something wider about some of the difficulty of getting change through. And it's magnified, I think, in Parliament, more so than in other organisations for those reasons. So, we know a lot of this already about how difficult change is, some of the factors that are at play when we are embarking on a change effort. But despite all this, we tend to keep making exactly the same mistakes each time a change effort, a reform programme is introduced. Firstly, there is a tendency to still focus on the big things, which for most people inside the institution will simply tell you how daunting this task is. It tends to emphasize the difficulty of getting change, the size, the level of disruption. Even though it looks like a good strategic analysis of what needs to change for the institution, it's less compelling for the individuals, which relates to the second point. Most of the arguments about change within the public sector, within politics, within government, within private sector organisations will tend to emphasise how this benefits the company or the ministry or the government. The arguments are intellectually coherent, but they're not compelling for individuals because they tend to deal in abstract principles around decentralisation, democracy, accountability, efficiency, profit, all those things. Those are fine, but they don't motivate individuals to want to change their own behaviour. And change is often understood in terms of the structures rather than the people. So the focus of change tends to be the institution, not the individual. So you'll often end up with changes which make the buildings look different, but people end up behaving in exactly the same way, perhaps in slightly nicer, more efficient, different looking surroundings, but the behaviour is the same. They're still doing the same things, just in different surroundings. And the final point is that, as I say, all political reform will involve some redistributing of power. If you're introducing change into a political organisation, it means they're rebalancing of power. Some will win, some will lose. And the losers will fight hard to resist change. And often change efforts don't anticipate that resistance, that active resistance. Too much in change management literature, the biggest problem identified to change, it will most of the change management books tend to focus on inertia, a preference for the status quo. In politics, in government, when power is at stake, it's active opposition to change, which is a bigger problem than inertia. Inertia is also a problem, but that active resistance is also there, and a lot of change efforts do not anticipate that or work out how to get around it. So what it means is that most reform efforts start by maximising all the possible opposition there might be to a programme of change. So the book, towards the end, you'll have to forgive me because the book, I haven't actually finished writing the book yet. And so therefore I'm trying to hold on to some of the central ideas until the book is published. So I will give you 5 principles, which is the final section of the book, which tries to bring a behavioural approach to institutional reform and political change. The first one, we need to understand that all change is behavioural change. Jeff Mulgan, who is quoted there, is now a professor, I think, of social policy at the University College London, but had an extensive career in British politics. He was the head of the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit when I was in government, and worked in various charitable and public sector organisations. His book, The Art of Public Strategy, is an interesting read. But as he says there, he's talking here about the centre of governments and the tendency when you're at the centre of government to think you need to change the structures in order to get change. But as he says, it's striking the most effective leaders achieve as much through influence and norms as they do through formal mechanisms. In other words, you don't need necessarily to change the structures. You need to be changing the norms, the expectations, the behaviour of individuals. And the purpose of reforming structures has to be to change behaviour. I'll give you one example from a parliament where the focus on structures tends to be a problem. Actually, I'll give you 2. In the first instance, I done work in Afghanistan, and Afghanistan was the system of government in Afghanistan is the product of billions of dollars spent by the international community trying to create a system of government which they recognise and they see as satisfying what they were trying to do in terms of supporting the Afghanistan state. And the institutions of government broadly approximate now what they were trying to achieve. Unfortunately, politics is still going on elsewhere. Although the structures, the institutions, the buildings have changed, the dynamics of politics between the power brokers in Afghanistan is still exactly the same as it was. And it relies less on what happens inside those institutions than what is going on outside. And your ability to control a militia is more important than whether you hold a ministry. And the 2 things are often tied together. But the second example, which is a bit more specific, is in Indonesia. I think about 15 years ago, there was an attempt to try and strengthen the parliament to improve the quality of democracy there. And so the idea was that we should give the committees, the parliamentary committees, more power. What could go wrong? What happened was the committees, as soon as they got more power, then proceeded to threaten various public and private sector organisations with a parliamentary investigation unless they were paid off. So rather than stamping out corruption, it actually increased the opportunities for corruption. And it's a good example of how things can go wrong if you change the structures, but you don't change the underlying behaviour or the incentives to behave in certain ways. Behaviour is central to all of this. If we want institutions to behave differently, it's about the people inside the institutions. That the structures, reforming the structures may prompt behavioural change, but it doesn't guarantee it. In the same way that governments will often legislate as a prompt towards behavioural change. But legislation, again, is of no use unless it is actually resulting in people doing things differently, understanding that certain things are legal and not legal. And it's the behavioural change which is central to those laws working in the same way as it is that if you change structures in an institution, it's the behaviour which determines whether they're effective or not. And there's a book which is now probably 30 years old, and I must try and find more up-to-date figures on this, but it's called The Critical Path to Corporate Renewal, which pointed out that the most successful change efforts inside private companies tended to set goals, but I think 90% of the top third of the most successful change efforts set behavioural goals. It wasn't just setting goals for the organisation, it was setting specific behavioural goals, and they were by far the most effective. And again, going back to John Cotter, this phrase, you know, change will stick when it becomes the way we do things around here. The second point, the second principle in terms of a more behavioural approach is trying to understand what all this looks like from the inside. And in my work, working with politicians in particular, there's often an assumption that politicians should be upholding abstract, democratic principles, which they should be. But there is often an assumption that this is what drives all of their activity. But politicians are like everybody else. When change is mooted, your first question is, how is this going to affect me? Quite closely followed by a second question, which is, why should I make my life more difficult? And these two questions go to the heart of understanding what change feels like on the inside and giving you a sense of how likely that, if you can answer those questions, change is much more likely to occur. And this links to a second insight from behavioural economics, and one that again comes from Daniel Kahneman's book. He uses the acronym that you see there. What you see is all there is, reflecting the tendency of people to focus and to give far more weight to what is in front of them at the moment. The appeals to wider principles about, this is going to be good for the organisation, this is going to, increase the company's profit, are all fine. But they have to also answer those first two questions. What is the immediate stuff that people are dealing with? And a lot of our work has focused on, we're trying to strengthen the institutions of government, parliaments, ministries, the civil service, at many levels in the government sector. But that change has to combine, how can we help you do your job better, as well as how do we get the institution to work more effectively? It has to combine the long-term benefits as well as the stuff which people are dealing with today. People who are busy will be focused on what's on their desk. So how can we help you do that more effectively? How can we help you achieve what you want to achieve? Whether it's promotion, whether it's more money, whether it's move to another job, whatever it is. How can we help you do that in a way that also strengthens the institution in the long run? And there has to be some sense of combining that personal interest with the wider principle. The two books on the side are interesting books. I mean, the first, the Switch book, is a very snappy, it's meant for a wide audience, understanding how change happens. It's an interesting book. There's a lot of stuff which draws on behavioural economics in the book, but it's written in a very accessible way. And they talk there about finding the feeling. It's no good having abstract plans for reform. You have to find the feeling in the institution, but you then, once you've found that, reinforce it with that institutional principle. And what they point out is that, if you're asking people to change, they're much more likely to do it for a colleague than they are for the organisation as a whole. So if you're asking somebody to change something, can you do this for me because, is much more compelling than can you do this because, the organisation is going to benefit from it. And the book about reciprocity is from a professor at the LSE, and how reciprocity, that sense of obligation to others, underpins an awful lot of how public policy could and should work. Those feelings of reciprocity are very, very powerful when you're trying to get people to change. The third point, this was said to me when we first started working in Iraq in 2008 with the parliament there. And it was said to me by one of the people who'd been there for a few years already, who said, look, the thing about this place is you have to think big, but you have to act small. And this comes out in a number of different ways. The first slide here, Duflo Banerjee won the Nobel Prize for Economics last year. And they have been credited, most of their work revolves around doing randomized controlled tests on the small things that make a difference to the bigger problems. My experience of coming into the international development field, because much of our work is funded by the international development agencies like the UNDP, like DFID as was, like USAID, and the principle often underpinning most of those projects is we shouldn't do anything unless we can do everything. There is a real ambition there, which is great. That ambition is great, but it's often the magnitude, it's the size of stuff, which makes actually achieving those changes highly unlikely. And most people go into those projects knowing they're not going to achieve what they think, what the project document says they are going to try and achieve. And it means you're put off from doing the smaller things because you need to do the bigger things. You need to focus on the bigger things, even though you know you won't get to the big things. And Duflo and Banerjee are a very good antidote to this, as that quote there says, which I think is from the Poor Economics book. It is possible to make very significant progress against the biggest problems through the accumulation of a set of small steps, each well thought out, carefully tested, and judiciously implemented. And this reinforces one of the second and third thought from behavioural economics, this idea of radical incrementalism. David Halpern is the head of the nudge unit in the UK, who some of you no doubt will know. And David and I worked very closely together when I was in government, because he was then in the Prime Minister's strategy unit as well. And we've continued this conversation about some of these things over the course of the last couple of decades. But his point there is that change will happen, is much more likely to happen, but again, by this accumulation of small things, rather than trying to do big things in one go. And he talks about, some of you will be familiar with the success of British cycling over the last decade or so, which has been largely based on what is called the science of marginal gains. Rather than thinking we can suddenly create a whole set of new British cyclists who are going to beat the world, what they looked at is, what are the small things that we can do differently? How can we gain half a second on the opponent by changing the shape of the bike, by changing the shape of the handlebars, by even ensuring that people, the bike riders get a good night's sleep? What sort of beds are they sleeping on? That level of detail. Once you put all these things together, you start to see the bigger change. And it's important that organisational change needs that vision and those big strategic objectives. But you have to understand that most of that change tends to be the result of many, many small changes accumulated over time. It's very rare that the big change does what you think it is going to do. In our field, over the last decade, we've worked in places like Libya and Egypt and Iraq, which went through, and we were currently working in Sudan, where there's seismic changes, where, leaders have been overthrown. Those big changes mean that you can do new things, but it then takes time for the institutions to settle down. And most of our work has been at that smaller level. How do you get these institutions to work? One of the reasons that the experience of working in Libya, which I'd be happy to talk about in more length, was fascinating, because a lot of it fell apart because of those small things not happening inside the institutions of government in Libya. It wasn't so much the bigger things, it was the smaller things which often led to disaster. And in somewhere like Iraq, it's a slow process of reform and trying to strengthen the system in Iraq. And we were working alongside bigger organisations with massive budgets, trying to do everything at once. And we focused on, well, do the staff have job descriptions? Do they understand what their job is? Do they have the skills to do their job? Do they know what others are doing? Do they know how they're working together in order to achieve something which is bigger than what they're doing individually? And a lot of these things were just simply missing. Now, you can achieve those bigger changes without that, but it's much more difficult unless you've got, those small basic steps in place. And it's similar to use a footballing analogy. You will have your tactics for the team when you go into each match. If you look at, to take British teams, if you look at Liverpool or Manchester City, they will have a style of football, and the players will understand what Pep Guardiola or Jurgen Klopp wants from them as a team, to play a high pressing game, to chase the ball, to be passing from the back, all of that sort of stuff. But at the same time, each of those players needs to know what their job is inside those bigger team tactics. They need to have a personal responsibility. And I think that combination of the bigger strategy along with those smaller things is absolutely essential to getting institutional change. The fourth principle, this is the fourth out of 5, so the next slide will be the penultimate slide, is about creating pockets of good practice and a ripple effect. The social norms, behavioural norms are often regarded as one of the main blockages to getting change inside organisations. The book there, the Robinson and Acemoglu book, talks about, again, it's a wide-ranging history of political change, and talks about this cage of norms, how in different societies the norms, the social, behavioural, cultural norms prevented the development of political institutions in all sorts of different ways, and often kept autocratic leaders in power, or kept corruption going. And this cage of norms is a very powerful idea, but those norms can also be a very important catalyst for wider institutional change. The problem is if you've got a big part of the public sector, or a company, or a ministry, or a parliament which works in a certain way, the people inside that institution are socialized into working into certain ways. They will recognize the norms within that institution that, as the Cotter phrase goes, this is the way we do it around here. So the question is, how do you start to break that down? And the short answer is, don't try and do it all at once. The way in which we have worked is by trying to create those new norms in small places, rather than going into institutions and trying to change the structures all in one go, rather than emphasizing the size of the task. We start in small pockets of that institution, and we make a virtue of that. If you look at most organizations, especially cutting edge organizations who are innovating all the time, they do it in small groups. It's not the whole organization that's innovating at the same time. It's small parts of that organization who are encouraged to experiment and try new things. And so you can make this look like a special thing. It's not like you're trying to force change on people. This is an experiment in trying to do things differently. You're going to be at the cutting edge of what we're doing here. You then try to develop new practices, techniques, ways of working, and repeat them. So they become new norms. They become the way of working in those small pockets. Utilize then the fact that this is different to the rest of the organization. Look how well this is working. We should try and replicate this in other parts of the organization. Continue to refine it. We'll let you adapt it. But what we aim for, as the title says, is the pockets of good practice in the first place, and then the ripple effect. And this works in politics, because politicians in particular, if they see somebody else doing something which is successful, they will emulate it. They will want to do it the same thing. And our experience in Iraq is telling on this front, because we initially started working with two committees in Parliament. Within 18 months, we were working with 11 committees. These were the pockets of good practice. We had 10, 12, 15 MPs all working together. After 3 or 4 months of working with the two committees, we kept getting questions. Why are you only working with these guys? Why can't we work with you as well? So rather than change being seen as a bad thing, it was seen as a special thing, almost a privileged thing. And what happened was the committees started to copy the practices in the other committees, because they could see they were working. They wanted to be part of something that was successful. And at the same time, the speaker then asked us to develop a system which would embed a lot of these changes. He asked us to provide the indicators for committee performance across the institution, which the committees would then have to hit. So we were working simultaneously from the top down and the bottom up at the same time, and getting this ripple by doing it both top down and bottom up, getting this ripple right across the whole of the organization. Final principle. As I mentioned earlier, the magnitude of the task tends to be the way that most change is framed. It has to have this big strategic vision, but the individual bits, the bits that actually make that big vision stick together, are often missing. And what tends to happen is that most change efforts tend to rely on these short, focused bursts of intensive activity. We've got to change things now. Simon Sinek is very interesting on this, and there's that link there, which I'm happy to circulate, is for a little animated YouTube video of about 3 minutes of one of his talks. where he talks about this tension between consistency and intensity. And as he says, if you're trying to get fit, you go to the gym, most people will probably just do it in short, intensive, bursts of activity. At the start of the new year, I'm going to get fit, I'm going to go to the gym, you do it for 3 weeks, and then you stop. And what happens? You don't get any fitter. But one of the better examples he uses is brushing your teeth. Now, why does brushing your teeth actually work? It's because you do it every day, twice a day. But as he questions, how often do you need to actually brush your teeth before it starts to work? Don't know. How many times can you afford to skip brushing before it stops working? Don't know that either. But what you do know is that you have to keep doing it, otherwise you will feel the effect. It's the consistency of that activity rather than the intensity. You can brush your teeth harder if you miss a couple of days. It's not going to make a huge amount of difference. And the same is true when it comes to institutional change and thinking about change within organizations. The thing is, a lot of change efforts are focused on intensity because it's easy to design and to measure, which is why we like it. You can see, well, over the next 6 months, we're going to do this, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do this, which is fine. The consistency stuff is much less easy to plan, to track, and to do, but it's the repetition of those multiple small things that creates that lasting behavioural change. This is the final slide, because I'm aware I've been talking for about 45 minutes. Just to try and sum up some of this stuff. I think the key point for me, and one of the key elements of the book, is that when you're thinking about politics, when you're thinking about government, when you're thinking about political change or organisational change in the public sector, it has to be understood as a human process. How does this look through the eyes of the individuals who are inside that organisation? How does change make sense to them? And what does it do for them? How does it help them to achieve what they want to achieve? And there's often a tendency to assume that individuals should come towards the organisational needs. That's only really likely to happen if the organisation also bends to the needs, the wants, the desires of the people inside it. And this is one of the key lessons from behavioural economics, is change is much more likely to happen if you make it easy for people to change. One of the central insights of behavioural economics is that people aren't very good at doing things which are in their long-term best interests. You ask people if they would like to be healthy, they'll say yes. Well, are you going to eat more healthily? Yes, well, but I'll do that next week. Today I'm going to eat pizza and chocolate. Those short-term desires often override what we know in the long term to be good for us. So a lot of the nudge theory is based around trying to allow people those human foibles, though, to respond to those short-term needs in a way that also benefits them in the long term. And that, I think, is at the heart of a lot of this stuff. It's important to recognize the resistance that comes from loss aversion. It's important to understand, the pressure from the immediate challenges as well as the long-term issues, and understand the value of reciprocity in building those coalitions and pushing forward with that change. And that last quote, I think, seems to go to the heart of it, again from Richard Thaler, who I mentioned at the beginning. But the important thing is, when anticipating any sort of change, is to start from where the people are and not from where you would wish them to be. I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, for this excellent presentation and breakdown of an important thematic. So now we'll shift over to the Q&A. So far, we have 2 questions. We'll begin with the first question. How can we manage incremental institutional change in the face of growing public opinion, appetite for sweeping radical changes?
That's a good question. There is no easy answer to this. It's the first version of this talk had a slightly different beginning to it, but the question goes to the heart of the difficulty of change in politics, but also the tension at the heart of all human beings. There is often a desire for radical change, but that radical change will also bring with it costs. And if you think about this from a politician's point of view, the first question I said, is slightly jokingly, why do politicians do weird things? Why do they not behave logically? Well, actually, if you look at the pressures on politicians, the push for change right across many countries in the world, governments can no longer afford the things which they traditionally afforded, the things which they traditionally gave to citizens. But taking them away will come at an electoral cost and will bring people out on the streets. And the problem for government is that you need to manage those public expectations. Yes, we can change, but that is not cost-free. That comes at a cost for the public. It was summed up for me by a conversation I was having with somebody last year who is involved in public policy, who himself had been berated by somebody about the fact that the government wasn't doing more on climate change and in the environment. But in the same conversation was talking about how they loved driving their BMW around the countryside at the weekends. So effectively what that person was saying is, why aren't you stopping me from driving my car at the weekends? Why aren't you forcing me to get an electric car? And it's that there is, this is not a very good answer to the question, partly because the question is such a big question. But the desire for radical change it comes with a cost. The radical change is not cost-free. There will be, there will be benefits to it, but there will also be things, new responsibilities, new restrictions which come with that radical change. Things will be different, and it won't please everybody, and people will have different opinions. And the job of the politician is constantly to manage those tensions between the people who want, to use the European example, there are people who want much more expansive social security, health services, education. They want much more money spent on those social services. That's fine. That means more taxes. That means your taxes have to go up. And there's an equally vocal part of the population who wants their taxes to go down. And lots of people are in the middle and want both the better services and less taxation. And you can't have these things. And that's the job of the politician, to be constantly managing those conflicts of interest in a way which is best for the state. I think the only way to address this, is to, what I was saying towards the end there, you need to be both having a big vision, a sense of what the purpose of this change is for, but also ensuring you get those short-term wins. So you're giving people what they need in the short term, but moving to something which is beneficial in the long term as well.
Excellent answer. So I think it goes back to one of the themes in the slides, think big and act small. We'll take the second question. How do we encourage pockets of good practice across different governmental institutions? What are the best ways to export these norms?
What are the best way to export
these norms?
It's without a specific example. The reason I'm pausing is I'm trying to think of a practical example, because as I said in the talk, if you deal in abstract principles, it seems people don't get it. Well, I did obviously in my previous job I wrote a lot of speeches for ministers, and I've since been doing courses on speech writing. And one of the key principles of the speech writing is either do really big, talk about the world, talk about the big changes, or do really small. People engage with either the big or the small. When it's somewhere in the middle, people forget it very quickly. That's why I'm trying to think of an example, and I'm really struggling. I think I have to go back to the example that I used in the talk, which was about our experience of working with the Parliament in Iraq and with the committees. Because those committees are already there as small groups within the institution who are there to look at education, health, reconstruction, whatever it might be. So we were working with structures that were already there, but giving them a new sense of purpose, trying to say to them, we can help you be more effective. Just to give you one example, we worked very closely with the Health Committee, which was made up of 11 very intelligent people, all of whom were doctors or pharmacologists, and they all knew what was wrong with the health system in Iraq. and they were all writing their own reports and then sending them to the ministry. So at one point, the ministry had 8 reports from the same committee, all saying different things. And what we said to them was, if you're going to be effective, firstly, get one report. You all need to agree on what you think. Because at the moment, the minister is just ignoring everything that comes from this committee because there's too much information and it's all contradictory. Get one report which you all agree on, which is not a party view or a factional view. It's the view of the whole committee and your experts. Secondly, what you're offering at the moment is opinion. We know that this is an expert opinion because we know you're doctors. However, the minister is also an expert and he can just decide to dismiss your opinion. Go out and get the evidence. Your recommendations will only be as strong as the evidence on which they are based. So go out and get the evidence and work as a team to get it. Now, those 2 small things completely changed the way the committee worked. And they saw that they were becoming more effective. And so what we were doing was trying to help them, firstly, become more effective as a committee, which they wanted to be, but also introducing principles which would then inform everything that they did over the course of the next few years and make them stronger as a committee. But it was solving a short-term problem and a long-term problem at the same time. And I think it depends, it'd be good to have an example to work with, but in any public sector organisation, any ministry, you need to be thinking about what do different parts of the institution do? What's the overarching goal of the organisation, of the ministry? You know, if the education ministry wants to, you know, I don't know, enrol many more kids in school or drive up educational qualifications in maths, start with that. Start with that section of the organisation where you can do things slightly differently, start to experiment with stuff and see if it works. Create new ways of working and create a sense of, the key thing which I didn't really elaborate upon was the sense of, you can play to a sense of pride. When you're working with a small part of an organisation, which is doing things differently and then doing them well, you don't need to encourage them to tell other people about what they're doing well. They will go and tell people for themselves. Other people think, well, that looks interesting. How do we do that? And as I say, it's a very human process. There's not a huge amount of complexity to this, but it's understanding basically what motivates human beings and starting to, as I say, start in small pockets and then seek to work out from them.
Excellent answer. I believe we're out of questions. No one has any other questions, so I'll go ahead and ask the last question and wrap it up. If you allow me, I'm sure you're aware of the situation in Kuwait currently. We're facing a dual shock crisis, lowering the price of oil and the constraints that the whole world is facing with regards to COVID-19. Is it of your opinion that times of crisis, and I put crisis in quotations, a good time to implement and push through reforms? If so, why?
The short answer is yes. The quote that is often used is, you know, you should never let a good crisis go to waste. It does allow you to do things which previously would have been difficult to do. The sense of a crisis, and you can see this in governments right across the world. The COVID pandemic has allowed them to do things which they wouldn't have been able to do before. They're spending far more money than would have been publicly acceptable 8-9 months ago. They're also introducing measures to allow the government to act, which wouldn't have been acceptable. But it also opens up the possibilities of doing things entirely differently. You've got a degree of, especially when you've got a sense of national concern about an issue. I mean, if I take one example, again from the UK, just over a decade ago, we had a scandal in Parliament about expenses, which was on, across the media. And it was, in the context, it was quite a small set of problems that were going on, because it was MPs effectively claiming more than they should do from the government's funds in terms of doing their job. But there wasn't big corruption. It was more small scale expenses, fiddling. But what it meant was that then, as a result of that, there were a whole series of changes introduced which dealt with much more deep-seated problems which everybody else had recognised, and that was the excuse to do it. That was the excuse for Parliament to do things in a very different way, in terms of constructive debates, in terms of engaging with the public, in terms of the information that was produced that allowed the public to see. And again, at the same time, now, the pressures, it's an odd position to be in economically. And in the UK today, we've had the Chancellor of the Exchequer set out his plans for the next year in terms of spending. And it's a very odd position because we are, the UK, as with many other countries, is significantly in debt. It's borrowing a lot of money to fund what is, what needs to be done now to keep the economy going. But that debt and the situation means that we are continuing to spend. In normal times, we would have to do something about this now, but it's meaning that we are continuing to spend it. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer has the license to continue spending that money and has public support to do it, which you wouldn't get in normal times, which allows him, the British government is spending more money on certain sectors, education, health, defence now, which perhaps wouldn't have been, they've been able to do previously. So again, I think it's not a specific answer to your question, because it sort of depends. But the short answer is yes. The other thing I would say, just to slightly contradict myself, is that that quote is often attributed to Rahm Emanuel, who was Barack Obama's chief of staff when he was president. Never let a good crisis go to waste. You can do that. It does allow you to do new things. It creates this sense of urgency, which is John Cotter's first principle. Create a sense of urgency, then things are likely to change. So the crisis creates that sense of urgency. And if you're clever as a politician, you can shape it towards certain ends. You define the problem and you also define the solution in a new way. But his boss, Barack Obama, has also been at pains to say, understand that all change tends to happen slowly. It's a question of things getting better day by day, step by step. It's not going to happen suddenly, but you do have, where there is a crisis, you do have the license to start experimenting and doing new things.
Excellent answer. I'm sensing you're going to have a good career in politics in the near future. So time is permitting. We have one more question that just got sent out. So it reads out: organizational change and the complexity of gender and age. Advice for young women aspiring to be change agents in the context of here and now.
These are tough questions. I was expecting easier questions than this. And they're tough because I can't engage with the person who's asking, and they're quite general. So it being, as a young woman trying to be a change agent, it's a bit, there are so many things that I could say about this, because there are so many different ways you could go with this. What I would say is that I have to go back to those last few slides, and principally, I think the advice, think big, act small, is as good a piece of advice as anything. Have a clear sense of what you would like to achieve and where you would like to achieve it, but accept that in doing that, it will be a whole series of small steps. To give you, there was another thing has jumped into my head, which is not directly relevant, but we do a lot of work on women's political leadership in many parts of the world. And we're involved in a very interesting project on male allies for more gender sensitive policy making, more gender sensitive budgeting, and policies which try to equalize men and women's rights. And one of the most useful ways into this is not to simply berate people who don't agree with you, or to try and convince people who are absolutely opposed to gender equality that they need to be concerned about gender equality. Start by showing them these statistics. And in the policy sense, this is very, very powerful. If you disaggregate statistics in any policy area, they will tell you something really interesting. So if you break down, in education, for example, the difference between rates of attainment, rates of attendance, rates of qualification between girls and boys and men and women. This will tell you very interesting. Then if you break it down by subject, this tells you something interesting as well. The assumption is often that, boys are better at scientific subjects and girls are better at art subjects. Actually, the statistics vary hugely from country to country. But then if you look at employment as well, what's the rate of employment between men and women? And then you break it down by sector, different parts, from tourism through to science, how many men and women are employed in those different sectors. Then you look at the use of public services. Who uses health services more? Which aspects of health service do you? Once you start to talk to any policymaker, any politician about that level of data, this is a way of explaining to them, look, you could get your policy much more effective if you understand that policy affects men and women in very different ways. And understanding that means you can then direct funds in the most efficient way to get the results that you want to get. So you start by having that conversation by piquing their curiosity, by trying to get them to understand the differences that exist in the first place, and then getting into a conversation about what you need to do with them. So you're framing the problem and framing the solution. I hope that helps answer the question.
Excellent. So we have another long question. Bear with me. A really good friend of ours, Marwan. I'm surprised that your presentation is biased towards parliamentary change and reform. One would imagine that this is the least priority of the general public sector malaise. However, most of your points do apply to the public sector as well. But the general public sector is much bigger than the parliament, and consequently is a mammoth of a task to reform. In fact, it is a problem that has persisted since the Sumerians and the Babylonians, and even Plato debated it with his students, all to no avail. Why do we think that we today, with our shrunken span of attention, can be more successful? Question. I would imagine that structure slightly supersedes behavior. This is, of course, a long discourse and needs to be exaggerated rather than downgraded, especially as there are a number of out-of-the-box ideas. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Marwan. To answer the first part of that question, it's focusing on Parliament because that's where a lot of our work has been, and my background is, and also, as you allude to in the question, it's the fact that parliamentary change, as I tried to explain, is really complex because of all the factors at work, because power is dispersed and contingent. They are much more difficult to reform than organisations which have somebody at the top driving it through. But the point was to use those examples to explain why public sector reform is, what the parallels are with public sector reform. In terms of the ability to change stuff, I mean, it comes again from my own experience, and I mean, I keep going back to Iraq, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, we first started working in Iraq in 2008, and it's a place that's I have a lot of fondness for, and lots of friends in institutions trying to do good things, trying to push reform. And to the outside world, it looks like a complete mess, but I can see how much it has improved actually in the last 12 years. It was entirely dysfunctional a decade ago, and it is getting better. It still has massive, massive problems, but there is, it's going through a tough time at the moment, but I can see how it's changed. And in every single country in which I have worked, there is always something that you can do, provided again you've got this sense of a clear strategic objective, but you're looking at the small things, how the small things change, and often those small things will result in much bigger change than you expect, and often much quicker than you expect. And it's I'm reminded of the Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci, who said that you always needed to have a pessimism of the intellect, but an optimism of the will. And I think that's the combination that you need to have, a sense of reality about things are bad, but have an optimism that things can change. And I think, I mean, there is all the places in which we are working right across the Gulf, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Eastern Europe. Lots of stuff is very, very difficult, but there is reason to be optimistic if you're focusing on doing specific things and doing them better.
Very well said. Diplomacy 101. Last, since we still have some time. So, do you think change management principles and enablers would differ from one culture to another?
Yes, I do. But I mean, the other thing that I would say is that those differences shouldn't get in the way of where the similarities are. And I mean, as I've sort of explained over the last 15 years, I've traveled a huge amount. And when you travel to a new country, the first thing you see are the differences. What's different from what you know, what you are familiar with. It's not long before you just start focusing on the similarities. And most human beings are motivated by the same sorts of things everywhere. And the same basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs is generally the same everywhere. And in terms of the specific detail of change management techniques, yes, they will vary from culture to culture, but also from institution to institution. But ultimately what you're dealing with is human beings. And it's understanding the key point of my book and of the process of, this approach to change is, as I said towards the end, understanding what does this look like through the eyes of the people inside the organization? How does it feel to them? And if you can do that, that will then lead you to understanding how change is most likely to happen. And I think that's the key thing. Excellent.
Thank you for your answer, Greg. It was a real honor and pleasure to have you tonight with us, kicking off the your first lecture for the season due to COVID and due to the last couple of weeks of constraints. Thank you to our dear audience, and we look forward to having more lectures in the upcoming months. Look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our translator, Lamia. And we will see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faris. Thank you all. It was a pleasure. Thanks. Cheers. Bye.